I looked at these comments beforehand, and it occurs to me, I don't know, this is something about me or about just doing philosophy. I realized there's nothing nice in here about the paper, and I thought I should say I did think it was quite an important topic, and I was very pleased to get a chance to comment on it and read it and think about it. First, there are two preliminaries, and it might strike you this is just a bit of autobiography, but it seemed like if I could convey a bit of how I'm looking at things, it might make the other things I have to say somewhat more clear. So two preliminaries. One, I'm not entirely sure what the main issue is here, because I'm not sure what Richard means by epistemically reasonable or justified, and therefore I'm not quite sure about what reasonable disagreement is. Concerning the parties to a reasonable disagreement, Richard writes, I quote, I'm not assuming that they each must have knowledge level justification. Some weaker standard is at work here. It's probably most natural to take the idea here as follows. Reasonability is the same epistemic value that is necessary for knowing, say what Plantinga calls warrant, but less of this value than is needed to know. But there's another possibility. Here it is. Reasonability is not the epistemic value that's crucially involved in knowledge at all. It's something completely different and, in some sense, easier to come by. For example, it might be the kind of egocentric or subjective rationality that Foley has written at length about. Later on, Richard tells us a little more about this. He says, epistemic justification is a matter of conforming one's beliefs to one's evidence, and he tells us the evidentialist idea can be expressed in terms of epistemic oughts, but neither really clears up what the target concept is. When we say you ought to believe this, I mean, what is it exactly we're saying? And when you say, you're justified when you conform to your belief, I mean, what are we saying that this is something that's subjectively rational, or are we talking about something in the knowledge ballpark? So I might be, this might just be my idiosyncratic way of looking at things, but I find it most plausible to take the concept at issue in the debate here to be some sort of egocentric rationality rather than something in the neighborhood of warrant. What I mean is, I think when people say we can reasonably disagree, they're not saying I can have what's really involved in knowledge and you can have it too. I think they're saying something more like, I can have this coherent view and you can have one too. But maybe that's just me. I'm willing to talk about oughts without voluntary control, but I do think that for talk of oughts to make sense, they must have the proper sort of ground. Something sufficiently important has got to be at stake for it to make sense of talk about oughts. And it never became clear to me that there was some such thing, a thing of such moment at stake in Richard's account. So I was still, even setting aside the voluntary stuff, voluntarism issue, a bit uncomfortable about the oughts, and maybe a little more about this later. Here's the second preliminary. Thinking about these issues in the way I find most natural, the way things seem to the believer is hugely important. So if you ask me whether it's reasonable for S to believe H on evidence E, my initial inclination is to say this will depend, at least in part, on how things seem to S, more specifically on whether it seems to S that H is true or likely to be true given E, and whether it would continue to seem so to S upon appropriate reflection. I suppose this means that I would want to sign on to something in the neighborhood of the view Richard attributes to Rosen and Vanenwagen, although I'd have to say the insight talk is makes me a bit queasy. So seeming talk, okay, insight talk, I don't know. I should also say at the outset that I find a view that Richard has little sympathy for intuitively attractive. According to the view I favor, that things seem a certain way to me makes a difference with respect to what it's reasonable for me to believe. You recall this passage from Richard, I hope. If these insights and seemings make an evidential difference, it can't be that the mere fact that one of them happens to be mine makes that difference. I hope I can say something to support this view that Richard rejects, and that's what I'm most worried about. But I can't resist beating around the bush, so first two small things. One, propositions can seem more or less likely to be true to a person. Simple logical, mathematical, and conceptual truths typically seem extremely likely to be true to those who adequately grasp them. Indeed, it would usually seem that such propositions could not possibly be false. Other propositions, for example, some complex and controversial philosophical theses, might, after sufficient reflection, come to seem likely to be true to a thinker without coming close to seeming as though they could not possibly be false. Surely we should take the degree of felt likelihood of truth into account, but as initially presented, Richard's approach to disagreements between peers does not take this into account at all. Compare a case where, given E, H seems to me only somewhat more likely to be true than false. And I then learn that a trusted epistemic peer feels dead certain that it's false. With the case where I feel dead certain that it's true and I encounter a peer who barely comes down against H. Surely it would not be reasonable for me to react in the same way in both of these cases. The degree of felt likelihood, I should think, would matter. Second smallish point. Richard's view seems to push us consistently, or it might seem to push us consistently toward withholding in cases of disagreement. But this might be an artifact of his limiting the discussion to cases where one party takes E to support H and a peer takes E to support not H. Consider a case where I carefully consider H in the light of my evidence E, and I am not moved either way. H does not seem likely to be true to me, but neither does it seem likely to be false. Now suppose I encounter an epistemic peer, share evidence, and learn that my peer feels quite certain that H is true. Given Richard's dictum that evidence of evidence is evidence, it seems that when confronted with this sort of disagreement, the rational thing for me to do would be to sign on with H, because I thought the evidence didn't count either way. Now I got some evidence that counts in favor. It looks like I should go with H. But I wonder if this is a result that really is palatable to Richard, or should be palatable to us. And it's not an idle question. I'm asking it for this reason. I want to know what I ought to do with my indifferent, agnostic self when I encounter my particular epistemic peers, Planning and Vanenwagen. And I'm kind of indifferent, and they're telling me, well, you know what they tell you. So, looks like the view has the resources to sort of push you in some cases to believe when maybe you don't want to believe, as well as preventing you from believing when maybe you do want to believe. Okay, now two larger points. I said above that I'm inclined to think that the mere fact that things seem a certain way to me rather than to someone else can make a difference with respect to what it is rational or reasonable for me to believe. I'll try to suggest two reasons in support of this anti-democratic sentiment. One, let's reconsider the argument against skeptical responses to disagreements among peers that focuses attention on seemings and concludes, in effect, that all evidence cannot be shared. The idea was that in such a case, there will be one crucial thing that I cannot share with my epistemic peer. H seems likely to be true to me on the basis of the evidence that we can share. Let's agree with Richard in taking this to be part of my evidence. So my evidence for H is actually E, the shareable part, and S, how things seem to me. And my disagreeable peer's evidence is actually E plus S prime, how things seem to her. It's certainly possible that it is reasonable to believe reasonable to believe H on the basis of E and S, and reasonable to believe not H on the basis of E and S prime. Hence, we're not necessarily driven to the skeptical response to disagreements. Nothing surprising here. Rationality does not require my peer and I to believe the same thing for the simple reason that we do not have the same evidence. As you'll recall, Richard's not convinced. He's willing to grant that all evidence cannot be shared and that how things seem to the parties matters, but he maintains that the argument against the skeptical conclusion stops short, that it has also left out some of the evidence. For when I encounter my peer and learn that we disagree, I also learn about the way things seem to her. That is, it seems to her that not H is true. Applying the dictum, the evidence of evidence is evidence, this gives me evidence against H. In effect, my evidence is actually something like E and S prime. Right? I learned that I now have evidence that things seem that way to her. And my peer's evidence is E and S prime and S, because she learns how things seem to me. So things are symmetric again. So we actually do have the same evidence, or as close as matters to having the same evidence. And hence, it can't be the case that it's rational for me to believe H and rational for my peer to believe not H. But of course, this isn't quite right. My peer and I do not gain access to the way things seem to each other. What we gain is merely belief in a proposition that represents how things seem to the other. And I would say it provides a rather thin representation at that. I learn that it seems to her that not H is true. She learns that it seems to me that H is true. It's easiest to see the difference I'm trying to get at between the seeming itself and the proposition that things seem a certain way in a perceptual example like the one that Richard describes. The totality of the visual experience that grounds a belief that the dean is on the quad is extremely rich. If all I learned from a peer were that she seemed to see that the dean was not on the quad, I would think that, depending on the particulars of my experience, it would be perfectly reasonable for me to go on believing. In particular, if my perceptual experience were, to borrow Descartes' terms, especially clear and distinct, and all I knew about how things seemed to my peer were that it seemed to her that the dean was not there, I believe it would be reasonable for me to go on with how things seemed to me. Of course, if my perceptual experience were different, then so believing might not be reasonable. For example, if my visual experience was blurry and fleeting and seemed like something was in the way, it would clearly be unreasonable of me not to back off from my claim that the dean is there in the face of my peer's disagreement. The important point from my point of view is that various features of the seeming, in this case of perceptual seeming, make an important epistemic difference. Of course, I admit I'm oversimplifying. My peer could describe to me various aspects of her visual experience, and I could do the same, but I don't think it would be possible for her to share her experience in its entirety, and it wouldn't be possible for me to share mine. So there will always be a difference between my evidence and hers, a difference that's traceable to the fact that this is the way things seem to me, and that's the way they seem to her. And the specific natures of these seemings can, I think, play a role in determining what it's rational or reasonable for each of us to believe. I think the same thing can be true of intellectual seemings as well. While it may not be the case that intellectual seemings typically may, I'm sorry, let me try again. And while it may be the case that intellectual seemings typically are nowhere near as phenomenologically rich as perceptual seemings, I do think their phenomenology outruns what we can convey to another person. This may be in part because our vocabulary for talking about the nature of such seemings is undeveloped and limited. compared to our vocabulary. We're talking about how things seem to us perceptually. Here's the second point, and I think this is the really crazy part, so let's see what you think. The case I've just made does not really deny Richard's claim that if these seemings make an evidential difference, it can't be that the mere fact that one of them happens to be mine makes that difference. What I tried to do above, in effect, is show that the fact that one seeming is mine might give me special access to features of the seeming that can be epistemically relevant. But I would like to deny the claim more directly and say that the mere fact that one of the seemings happens to be mine can make an epistemic difference, a difference with respect to what I ought to believe. And I purposely use ought here. So suppose that I have carefully reflected on some proposition and that it has come to seem very obvious to me that the proposition is true. I then encounter an epistemic peer who believes the proposition is false. I share evidence with my peer as far as this is possible. We both reflect thoroughly on our beliefs. We talk things out. But at the end of the day, it still seems dead obvious to me that the proposition is true, and it still seems to my peer that it is false. I've uncovered no specific reason to believe that my peer is making a mistake. I'm at a loss to explain what's going on with her. But nevertheless, I continue to feel dead certain that the proposition is true. What should I do? Richard would want to say that the fact that things still seem this way to me is more a sign of tenacity and stubbornness than anything else. Maybe it is a sign of these things, but nevertheless, I maintain that in such circumstances, what I ought to do is believe what seems to be true to me. Why? I said before that for talk of oughts to make sense, something sufficiently significant must be at stake. I think there is. Not to believe in accord with how things seem to me in the circumstances described would involve something like a violation of my epistemic autonomy. I would be submitting to an alien authority rather than believing what I myself have come to regard as the truth of the matter after thoroughgoing reflection. I sometimes wonder if it's so much as possible to do such a thing. I'm pretty sure that one cannot simply choose to do so in a moment, but if one can believe in opposition to this sort of seeming, however one might manage to get oneself to do it, it strikes me as a very bad thing to do to oneself. Persons who believe in accord with how things seem to them may be tenacious and stubborn, but at least they don't give up on themselves and knuckle under. I would think they show themselves the respect they are due as epistemic beings. Basically, what's behind this is I figure all you really got to go on in the end is how it seems. So if you're going to abandon that, you've given up the game. The game of thinking and trying to form beliefs and deciding and the like. Okay, last general kind of even vaguer point. So you might have one good conclusion about me now and say, well, if I say this will be vague, at least I believe in induction. I have a feeling there's a tension within the position Richard takes regarding disagreements. So I'm going to try and explain this. One might adopt what we might label an instrumental perspective on the rationality of human beings, ourselves included. We are all, in part, instruments for detecting the truth. The problem is we cannot get outside ourselves to calibrate ourselves. We've got to somehow use the very instruments we want to calibrate to do the calibrating. When the instruments are all giving the same readings, it makes sense to trust them. But what are we to do when the instruments produce different readings? This is essentially the question we face when we encounter an apparently reasonable disagreement between epistemic peers. It's as if we had two thermometers that had apparently been working properly. At least they were consistently telling the same temperature. And then all of a sudden, for no apparent reason we could discern, in some situation they produce different results. What would it be reasonable to do? I'm not quite sure. Maybe we should throw them both away, form no judgment at all about the temperature until we can get a new thermometer. Or maybe it would be reasonable to take the temperature to be the average of what the two thermometers read. But it certainly would not make sense to just pick one of them at random and believe what that one says, ignoring the other one. So, anyway, well, that's kind of the one perspective, way of thinking about us and epistemic matters and what's important. And now, I try the other way. If one thought about human beings and what is as rational for them to believe in this instrumental way, which I suppose reliabilists and proper functionalists ought to find congenial, then I could see ending up with Richard's view. But this certainly isn't his view. It's not the way of thinking about things that seems to be congenial to him. He thinks that the reasonability of belief is determined solely by the evidence. There's not really any special role for the person to play. Given a certain body of evidence, it will be an objective fact that evidence supports some proposition, its negation, or neither. Given this way of looking at things, from this perspective, it would seem that whether my belief that H on evidence E is rational depends solely on whether E does in fact support H. If I encounter some other person who believes not H on the basis of the same evidence, it's not as if this other person and I are instruments with obscure inner workings, mysteriously producing different results. We can in fact look inside to see which is working properly. That is, can look at the relevant evidence. I mean, that's what it is to look properly from this point, to work properly from this point of view. It's to believe what the evidence supports. And this evidence, E, will either support H, not H, or neither. An encounter with an epistemic peer who assesses some evidence differently might lead me to think over the evidence again, but I don't see why, from this perspective, which I take to be Richard's, I don't see why this should seem to change anything. It's not as if this encounter provides me with evidence that there's some other evidence out there that I have missed and my peer has got. The only evidence I get, if you want to call it that, is that some other person assesses the evidence I started with differently. Fine. Still seems that if I assessed it correctly to start with, my belief's rational. If I didn't, I'm not. And so it seems that the natural place for someone with Richard's perspective to want to end up would be with what he calls the hard line. And that's why I think there's this tension. It seems to me that this more reliabilist way of thinking gets you where Richard ends up, and his way of thinking, I think, would draw you to the hard line. Thanks.